So, hi, everybody. I'm Steve Towns with the Center for Digital Government, and today I'm with Marc Moffett from Cisco. Marc leads system engineering for state and local government and education for the Eastern United States. Marc, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure, and glad to see you again.
Thanks, Marc. Today, Marc and I will be talking about IT modernization in state and local government. By way of the backstory, we partnered with Cisco at the Center for Digital Government on a national survey of state IT leaders around the drivers and the challenges surrounding government IT modernization. That survey took place slightly before the COVID pandemic hit. So we'll use those findings today as a backdrop for our conversation to look at how agencies are prioritizing and maybe rethinking IT modernization based on their experience in the pandemic response. So, Marc, I think my first question to you is, prior to COVID, I think we talked a lot about IT modernization in terms of, meeting rising user expectations, giving citizens a better digital experience. But I think one of the lessons we learned post-COVID is that good modern digital services, both for internal and external users, aren't just nice to have. They're a critical part of resiliency and business continuity. So how do you see the conversation changing around the importance and the urgency of government IT modernization now?
Yes, Steve, what a great question. I think prior to March, we were all thinking about, when we thought about citizen services and those type of things, everything was more directed, to your point, outward toward the actual citizen. But suddenly with COVID, and if I look at all of government, 21 million people are close to it being sent suddenly home overnight to work from home. To your point, it drove a very different conversation, and that is business continuity, and not in the typical sense where we've seen a site go down, or events like 911 where you've had a site catastrophe. This was truly a U.S.-wide issue where everybody had to work from home, and suddenly you were faced with multiple challenges, right? Is how do you give a government worker a quality experience given many different circumstances, lack of access to bandwidth, laptops, devices, those type of things, secure access to applications. So it truly did push a whole different mindset, I think, within government, to focus not only on the citizen externally, but obviously on the workforce, and how to continue to deliver those citizen services that are critical to our well-being.
Mm-hmm. So obviously the usability of those services remains important. I think even in our survey, it showed users prioritized really two things. I mean, privacy and security, but also a simple user interface. As governments start to rely even more heavily on digital services instead of in-person transactions, does experience take on even greater significance, and what does that mean for government agencies as they roll out these new services?
Well, you called out a couple of important things, and that's privacy, security, and then that simplicity. And look, before the pandemic, we had a sudden shift over the past several years of applications being distributed out into the cloud, and certainly a major driver of that was for people to have access anytime, anywhere to those applications. But as we moved past the pandemic, and we thought about, and we saw some of the things that emerged around, if I look at one of the central offerings or services, if you will, that's a requirement, is that's collaboration, just like you and I are doing now, right? We're still having to, months after this thing hit us all, communicate predominantly via some sort of a conferencing application, in this case, WebEx. And when you started to see some of the things that emerged, it was interesting. You never heard about security from a conferencing perspective until, again, a massive group of people had to do real business, right, and conduct business over virtual interactions like this. And so one of the things that suddenly emerged was that important privacy and security and transparency. That's kind of the three things we built WebEx on. And suddenly you've seen that ease of use start to take on a meaning there too, because being able to join meetings effectively, not everybody is a power user like you and I, so to speak. And so having easy access to these applications and being able to start them and leverage them effectively has become very important and top of mind for most.
Yeah. Our survey also showed, maybe no big surprise, still lots of old systems in the public sector. The bulk of our respondents said more than a quarter of their systems were legacy technology. In a lot of cases, it was more than half of those systems are legacy. Yet, one of the things we saw during the COVID response is agencies were able to rapidly deploy new technology as these new critical needs came up around remote work or virtual transactions, virtual meetings. What lessons do you think we can take from that, and how can they be applied to modernization going forward?
Well, I did a little bit of a talk at the Gartner Symposium last year on this topic of legacy and IT modernization. If you think about where most of those conversations have been in the past, it's really been around the application, around big premise-based, mainframes, those type things. Well, as those systems needed to be modernized for the cloud era, if you will, what we didn't talk a lot about in modernization was modernizing firewalls, routers, calling, meetings, all those things that are required to conduct business, because frankly, a lot of that has been done on premise, right, in government. I think one of the other things you guys found in the study is some general distrust, for whatever reason, in government around remote work. It hasn't been culturally one of those things. Well, suddenly now we're finding out, even from government, that they're finding people are more productive from wherever they happen to be, whether it's at home or a coffee shop or whatever that is. But I think what we learned, Steve, is that, look, we had a lot of customers that were WebEx customers, and they're using products like Umbrella and our Duo capability from security. So a lot of those as a service product solutions, if you will, were in place. And I think that's what allowed customers to quickly spin up. Again, the anchor product being collaboration, right? You were able to send people home immediately, join a WebEx, and you could at least communicate. Then we started to get into, okay, from a security standpoint, now how do you start to secure these users based on whether they're a true power user, kind of a lightweight user, or they're just periodically accessing applications. So as we transition past the immediate need of just getting people communicating, now it's become apparent that we need to rethink that architecture to make sure that we are able to deliver through an as-a-service type model, whether it's software as a service, things like Office 365, Salesforce, those type applications. WebEx, as I mentioned earlier, our security through virtual firewalls, Duo, Umbrella, those type services, we're able to do that from a cloud perspective to quickly spin up a secure infrastructure where government services can be delivered.
Yeah. Rob, you've answered a little bit of this question, I think, already, but you've stressed this need for hybrid and elastic systems so governments can be more responsive, around any uncertainty going forward, regardless of what causes it. Talk a little bit more about what those systems look like, and maybe more importantly, even, how do governments prepare themselves to move in that direction, given that it's so crucial?
Well, there's nothing like a good catastrophe to show us what we're capable of. And so one of the things, even since you and I spoke last time, that's been interesting, and I won't call out any state specifically, but just as we suspected government services can be delivered remotely, we've talked about this, I guess, elastic model, and we're even seeing it play out now. We were phasing back into some sort of normalcy. The cases started ramping back up, and now you're seeing a reversal of some of those decisions. And so I used this term before, elastic, where you really do start to have to think about whether it's workforce distribution, For this particular event or going forward, how do you start to think about the organization being able to flex back and forth from a premise-based to a wherever a person happens to be based situation, and building out an architecture that supports that's very important. You know, we talk about, again, securely accessing. So when you're talking about government, you are talking about a different level of access. You've got a lot of personal data there, right, when it comes to our citizens. And so being able to securely access those applications from wherever you are very important, right? And the security stack to be able to do that is critical.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about costs. I think everybody knows public agencies entering a pretty tough budget environment. And certainly there's costs associated with new technology, but I think one thing we don't talk as much about is the costs associated with old systems. You know, the bulk of our survey respondents said their IT teams spend anywhere from a quarter to more than half their time just keeping old systems and processes running. Almost 70% said old systems hurt business process efficiency. Talk about the impacts of that in terms of cost and performance and innovation, particularly when you're going into a tough revenue environment.
Yeah, I think what you called out, Steve, and you kind of hit on it, is typically I think we've seen the numbers 80% roughly of what you spend on any rollout is operating the environment. And so when you think about what's new and the opportunity we all have now, and I've dubbed it internally, at least within U.S. public sector, is this CLI to API transition, where we now have an API infrastructure, if you will, across our portfolio that allows us to really abstract the hardware, if you will, from the services we need to deliver from a government perspective. And being able to do that is something we've never really been able to do before. We've talked about end-to-end architectures and all those things for a very long time, but being able to actually get net DevOps, DevSecOps, those type things involved now, you're starting to be able to, again, abstract hardware from the services required. Being able to stand that up and operate it more efficiently obviously gives you a lot more control over your infrastructure. I'm not going to say necessarily doing it with less people, but what we've seen even within Cisco is when you start to look at automation and programmability and those things very differently from the way we've done them, what it does is it gives you time back to get your IT staff out into the agencies, if you will, into the business, and looking for those next opportunities to evolve, right? So it's doing more, so to speak, with less from an operating perspective, but it's also being able to get your folks doing higher level stuff and embedding in the agencies and being able to deliver different services, right, from a technology standpoint.
Yeah, interesting. So there really is a new way to do this. With that in mind, I mean, what would you encourage government IT leaders to focus on as they sort of map out this roadmap for modernization now?
So we last year when Chuck talked to the general sales organization at an event we called Impact, we really talked about three key areas as we evolve, and that's the first is reimagining your applications. And so if you think about what's driving a lot of what's happening, period, government or not, we're distributing applications as predominantly in the cloud as we are keeping them premise-based. So I think it starts with that application-centric view, right? Mm-hmm. Where does that live? And then regardless of where it lives, getting away from the legacy architectures of hairpinning everything back to a centralized organization and making sure through things like SD-WAN, software-defined access, those type technologies, that you can get to those applications effectively and efficiently from a remote location without necessarily having to expense more bandwidth and put in more hardware and those type things at a central site. Next thing is everything is about security, right? We've got to think about things from a full scope security standpoint. That's, if I look at it very tightly, we use things like AnyConnect and AMP and Duo, those type technologies for endpoint security. And then you get into the virtual firewall capabilities. We talk about zero trust things like Duo, all those things start to come into what I call just a good solid security stack that can be delivered either on premise, via the cloud, or in a hybrid type situation to give you that security. And then just from a software-defined everything, it's like we really have to think about this software-defined, got mentioned earlier, this automation, programmability, that part of how networking is evolving, and start to leverage the infrastructure in very different ways so that we're tying the infrastructure to those citizen services versus thinking about just the network as a delivery mechanism, if you will.
Yeah, interesting. Mark, here's my last question, and this may be a little hard to know, but give me your best guess. What do you think government workplaces look like as we look out into the future? And you've touched on this a little bit, but what's the technology that's going to support them working in those new ways?
Yeah, so Steve, we've heard some interesting statistics over the last couple of months. For example, states cutting building capacity by 2/3, for example, because they've found that they can continue to deliver the same level of services without necessarily having the same real estate footprint, which is a big deal. Obviously, the state starts to get back a lot of dollars, but when you start to do that, obviously you are starting to rotate a huge majority of your workforce to the home. So you have to start thinking about technologies. Again, I called out SD-WAN, right, for your power users. Those are heavy-duty users that need a branch-like experience at their home. And then you start to think about maybe that mid-level user that doesn't need that level of complexity, but you still need access, so you could do that through more of a software security stack. And then you've got your lighter weight users where it may just be a collaboration type touch point. So you got base level security and then something like web apps that rides on top of that. So I think you have to really start to think about, just like we did with multi-cloud and distributed applications, we have to think about now we're distributing people. And so when you're going to distribute people and allow them to work essentially from anywhere, you've got to re-architect your environment to be able to access those applications, both premise and from the cloud. And technologies like software-defined wide area networking, software-defined access, all those type tools that we're now working into the mix allow you to do those type things in a very different way.
Yeah, really interesting. So bottom line, government's not going to work the way it used to, and the technology needs to evolve to support that. Mark, I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you again. It's always fun, and hopefully this will be beneficial to the listeners.
Thanks, Mark.